Welcome everybody. Very happy to welcome today to our seminar series. The session today is dedicated to Olivier Ferrando's research. And I will briefly introduce him, but although I know that most of you have heard of him, he has been a director in the IFEAC here in Bishkek of maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But yes,
I was very young at this time.
Anyway, since then, you were still very much involved into IFEAC and in the research here. So we are extremely happy and honored to have him present his last book. So in French, La question minoritaire en Asie centrale, and in English, maybe we'll have an English translation. Yes, yeah. I mean, and maybe can think about an English translation later. But this book was published by IFEAC, and it's one of our bestsellers so far. That's why I'm thinking about it.
Really?
Yes, exactly. So we are all extremely happy to hear about the topic of this book, which is, timely topic here, and also maybe to hear about the reaction. I don't know what you're going to present, but maybe about the debate, maybe the book generates question you might have had since you published it. That would be really nice. So we are also very lucky to have today with us a discussant. She's a member of IFEAC, Lucia Diremberger. She will start the debate, start the question, and then we will end with we will open the floor to all the questions to everybody just afterwards. So I don't want to take too much time, and I'm extremely excited and happy to hear about your presentation, Olivier. And so I give you the floor right now.
Yes, thank you so much. So thank you for attending this presentation just 2 days before a big break, 1st of May. So as you can see here, the translation, because of course the book is in French, but it's a topic which is named the minority issue or the minority question, as translated in French. And I am addressing various elements. I will explain why it's such a long title and also with the dates, because it's very important. So this is the book here. And what I would like to give you is some background about why this book exists. And it was, okay, it's fine? You will not sleep?
Yes, I
okay.
think we see it.
So why this book exists and why I think it was important to publish it recently, though the research is quite old. You can see that actually I entered in the region in Central Asia more than 25 years ago. My first experience of Central Asia's cultural diversity, I put it into quotes because of course it's a topic, the cultural diversity of Central Asia, this diversity of population. I entered in '98 in the field of rural development because my first education is engineer. I'm an agricultural engineer, and I was working for the European Union Commission in Almaty in '98. And from 1999 to 2001, I was working with ACTED, that maybe some of you know. It's a French NGO, very active. It's the first NGO in France, actually. Very actively working in Central Asia, and I was the head of the Ferghana Valley program. So during 2 years and a half, I was living in Fujian, in Tajikistan, and covering also south of Kyrgyzstan, Batken, and Tashkent in Uzbekistan. So this was my first encountering of the region. And after doing this, of course, I cannot go into a PhD of political sciences, being an agricultural engineer. So I restarted my education in France, and I did a master's degree in international law with a special focus on minority rights. It was a very interesting master's degree that I did in Lyon, the Catholic University of Lyon, where I'm teaching actually today, because of the minority focus. Okay, it was something unique in Europe, and I had the chance to do it. This is why I entered through this question, and I continued doing a PhD that took about 6 years to be done, and the topic was minorities in Central Asia. So definitely having this focus. What is interesting in this PhD, and I just explained because this book is coming mostly from the PhD, is that I made a focus on a specific category of population to explain this cultural diversity. And this category is the ethnic minorities. Национальные меньшинства in Russian, so national minorities, but let's say that in the international terminology, we speak of ethnic minorities and the cross-border one. What was interesting for me was not really the Russians coming from Russia, or the Tatars, or because we know they are very numerous here also, but mostly those minorities across the border, the Uzbeks in Osh, the Tajiks in Samarkand, the Kyrgyz in Andijan, for instance. And my geographic focus was important because Central Asia is so huge. Because of my experience in the Ferghana Valley, I decided actually to have this focus on this micro region. It's huge, the Ferghana Valley, but still in comparison to Central Asia. And that's my geographic focus, okay? That's why I was really working on this region. For me, it was very representative of this diversity in Central Asia. It's a comparative approach between Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, though it's not exhaustive. That means that sometimes I'm illustrating if it's relevant, for instance, for one country, but not for the other. Like, for instance, the counting of the population, the census of population, is not done in Uzbekistan since 1989. So it's not relevant for Uzbekistan. There is no census at all for the last 35 years. Okay, so you don't know exactly how many Tajiks, Russians, etc. you have. In Kyrgyzstan, every 10 years, we have a very professional and quite good counting, for instance. So you see, it's not always exhaustive. And this is the Ferghana Valley. You probably all know and you are familiar with the Kyrgyz part, and Old Darabad, Batken, Isfana. And the Tajik one at the end of the valley, Khujan, the main city, and then in the middle, this piece of Uzbekistan with three regions, Namangan, Andijan, and Ferghana. So that's quite a huge region and almost 10 million inhabitants. So when I say micro regions, an anthropologist would just laugh at me. So it's really huge. But I'm a political scientist, so still for me, it's small. And the period is important also because it's contemporary, of course, but I'm starting already still in the Soviet period, because we know that at the end of the Soviet Union, there were many changes, above all in terms of recognition of diversity, also on supporting the creation of civil society, etc. So 89 was for me a key date, and I end in 2010 actually with a tragic moment. This is the conflict in Osh, that I think was important to mention. It was not supposed to go till 10, because I was supposed to finish earlier my PhD, but then I was caught by this conflict, and I will just give you 2 words on this. So it's this quite big period of 20 plus years that I'm covering. Okay. So the book, actually, because we're speaking of the book, not really of my PhD, but the book draws mostly on the PhD field research, because here I'm mentioning a lot of interviews and quotations, and the last interview was done in 2008. That's quite old now. I mean, it's 16, 17 years old. I have updated statistics, so there are some statistics from 2018, 2020, I think, but I didn't make any interview in addition to what I did before. Why I mention this? I'm fully aware, and this is probably one of the critiques can be done to my work, and I'm aware of this, that this research and this book are very situated in the development of knowledge on Central Asia. We know that in the 90s, in the 2000s, there was a huge wave of production of knowledge on a region that nobody could reach before. Historians couldn't have access to archives, political scientists were not allowed to come in the time of the USSR. So actually, I'm doing this research on this period of the 90s, the 2000s, and there was huge amount of work done on national building, on national identities building. I name here some of the very famous people at the time. Rogers Brubaker, for instance, who was doing it on the whole communist, post-communist region. Dominique Harel on Ukraine, for instance, and the language issue in Ukraine and the nationalities in Ukraine. Taras Kuzio, so many. So I wanted to say that actually this book is very situated in this period of production. It's nothing to see with what we are discussing today, with, for instance, decolonial approach of research, etc. Though I think it was important to publish it. And this reason is here. Why publish such a book 25 years after the research started in 1989, basically, in 1998, basically, when I first discovered what is an Uzbek in Osh and a Tajik in Samarkand. So the first thing is that after this big wave of 90s and 2000s, actually, there was a kind of dry up of the production. A lot of topics were developed, security, for instance, Islam, a lot, for instance, research done on Islamism and Islamic movement, etc. Maybe because there was a demand also from the policymakers. But the global knowledge of the region was not existing anymore. And few books have been published on identities in Central Asia since, let's say, the mid-2000s, okay? The second element that is the most important for me is the war in Ukraine. For me, it was a big shock, as probably for many of you, what happens in Ukraine. But for a researcher dealing with identities and with post-Soviet identities, what happened in Ukraine was really shocking me and was questioning, actually, what was my research doing? And if ever I was thinking that such a thing that's happening in Ukraine could take place in Central Asia. I know Kazakhstan, it is not the focus of my research, but I've been living in Kazakhstan. I've learned Russian, I do speak Russian, and I did all my research in Russian. What does it mean, actually, in current time? And this awareness related to the war, actually, was important because there were some underlying issues in Ukraine that were echoing in Central Asia, and I will just mention it quickly. The Soviet creation of national identities. This is one part of my book, explaining how the project of Lenin and the indigenization of all this manpower in Central Asia and the promotion of Central Asian nationalities, ethnicities, etc. Everything was perfect till 1937, and then the Great Terror of Stalin sent most of these nationalists, as they were called, or chauvinists, this was the official naming, to the Gulag, okay? So actually this political idea of national identities that actually could work in national republics just disappeared after 1937 and never developed again. So we are facing actually identities deprived of any political agenda in the Soviet period, okay? And even today, we can question this. What is the political agenda of these national leaders in Central Asia? Are they actually really sovereign, or are they totally linked to some foreign power, namely Russia? Okay, in Ukraine this is obvious. When Ukraine tried to be sovereign, well, there is an issue with Russia. What would happen if Kyrgyzstan wants to be sovereign and develop its own relation with some countries, but distancing from Russia? Okay, so for me it was important to just question this issue, and I will just give you some example later. The territoriality of identities is also very important. In my book and in my PhD, I was speaking of the Tajik of Samarkand, of the Uzbeks of Osh, of the Kyrgyz of Andijan province, etc. So naming actually an identity to a territory. So as if this was mattering more than actually the rest. This is definitely an ethnocentric territorial vision of identity. It means like if you are in Samarkand, you are Tajik, and there is no other way to define yourself. You may speak Tajik in Samarkand, but you may consider yourself as an Uzbek citizen, and really feeling part of the Uzbekistan as a country, and not like depending on Tajik support or whatever. But by naming Tajiks of Samarkand, actually, we just reproduce what the Soviet Union was producing, is these very ethnocentric territorial identities. That was serving, and the rule and divide game was here. So this is something that I didn't realize so much, and that the war in Ukraine helped me realizing. The status of languages. What are claiming the Uzbeks in Osh? Recognition of the language. What are claiming the Tajiks in Samarkand? Oh, recognition of the language. What are asking, etc. Always a language issue as a political issue. What about multilingual practices? When I was living in Central Asia in 98, 99, 2000, I was going to Tajikistan. At the border with Kyrgyzstan, everybody was speaking Kyrgyz. Every Tajik living just across the border. In Kyrgyzstan, you had a lot of people speaking Tajik when they came into Tajikistan just for economic purpose, to go to the bazaar, whatever. This has been lost, of course, because of the border. But multilingual practices are still very active in these regions, bordering regions overall. Huh? We never mentioned this. Obviously, for us, it's like if you're a Tajik, you speak Tajik, and if you're a Kyrgyz, you speak Kyrgyz, but you do have multilingual practices. And in Ukraine, this was obvious. You don't have the Russian speaking and the Ukrainian speaking. You have multiple forms of speaking in Ukraine. And above all, everybody understands each other in Ukraine. Maybe a Russian from Novosibirsk is not understanding a Ukrainian from Lviv. But a Ukrainian from Donetsk understands perfectly the Ukrainians from Lviv, although they don't speak the same language, it's Russian and Ukrainian, just because of the commonality of living together, okay? So this kind of practices was really not obvious for me. And the last point, the complex relation between history and memory. Holodomor, the big hunger in Ukraine, but also in Kazakhstan. Well, in Kyrgyzstan, we have the 1916 Urkun. This is also one very important element, and we know that it is very sensitive in the relation with Russia. Okay, so these are elements showing that actually Ukraine was opening my eyes and was opening the eyes of many of my colleagues as well, who were like coming from the Sovietology school in France, basically. So once again, all these issues were resonating in my research, and this is why the book is actually exploring from the inside the functioning of the multicultural societies, and this is the way I tried to do it actually when I decided with IFEAC to publish it, and Adrien, who was your predecessor, was saying, Olivier, you should, because actually we are questioning these issues, and we don't know, we don't have so many information about Central Asia, so maybe by publishing it, you will provide this kind of information. And what is interesting for me was that this multicultural society was developing in a changing social, economic, and political environment because of the transition, because of the political changes, but also because of a lot of events. The war in Ukraine has a big impact also on these kind of relations. Okay. The rationale of my book, and this will just to show you how it is structured, it is based actually on one assumption, that is that identity practices are the result in Central Asia of, and probably in many countries in the world, of external constraints and personal choices. So you have your own agency, you can make your own choice, but sometimes the path is already produced either by the state or by identity entrepreneurs, people who are thinking for you in terms of identity. So you have these external stakeholders who are assigning identities, okay? I'm French, this is something that I know perfectly, because being French, I am French, and I cannot be anything else than French. Maybe I can have some origin, but I cannot say that I'm Corsican, or I'm Basque, or I'm Arab, or I'm African. No, I'm French with some origin. In Central Asia, well, you are Kyrgyz, you are Uzbek, you are Tajik, you are Russian, you are Tatar, you are Jew. Okay, you do define yourself by this identity, but why? Because it was assigned in Soviet times, these kind of identities. So the state, as an external stakeholder, is extremely important, okay? Because they are the one deciding what is the model of society you are living in. In France, we are a civic model. We don't speak of ethnic groups, and it is forbidden by law to make a census on an ethnic basis, and you go to the jail for that, okay? But also representatives of the ethnic civil society. I name it ethnic civil society. The civil society, the NGOs, the organization, which are promoting, defending these ethnic groups. It can be a cultural organization, it can be a political party, whatever, but they do also define, and they have their own agenda, and they do define themselves this identity. So kind of assignation. Of course, this is a top-to-down approach. It's the state or the representatives who are applying it. So there is a wording which is identification, categorization, labelization, but this kind of way that is done for you, okay? On the other side, you have the agency. That means the individual socialization, the way you live, the way you connect with people. And in that case, it is a bottom-up approach, definitely, with a self-identification. What I want to say myself. I don't want to say I'm a Tajik from Samarkand. I'm a Samarkandi. Many of them say Samarkandi, because actually I'm just defined by my urbanity. I'm a member of this city. I don't care about this ethnicity. What is important is I'm from Samarkand. I'm proud of it. Who cares about the language? Huh? So the self-identification, the shared belonging in line or opposed to the external stakeholders. Usually you are in line with the external stakeholders. It's working very well. The state narrative, not to say propaganda, is quite effective. And in France, we are good muttons to follow also this kind of logic and avoid saying I'm Corsican by ethnicity, because this is forbidden. So it's clear that this external stakeholders approach is very active, but still you may have the possibility to define yourself differently, okay? And this is my rationale in the book. It's this connection between the three let's say, actors, stakeholders that are important, that matters for me. There may be others. The nation state as a producer of a model of society, the ethnic civil society as promoting a vision of what should be an ethnicity, a national group, an ethnic group, and the individuals, how they just manage it themselves. Yeah? Okay. And the book actually is structured along the 3 points of this analytical triangle. The first part is on nation building, the second part is on ethnic mobilization, and the third part is on individual strategies. Okay, that's explaining the title that I wanted to make long to avoid having the minority question as something very abstract. Yeah? Okay, so quickly, the structure of the book, I will just show you the parts and just focus on some points that may interest you. So part one is nation-state building, and I'm discussing here the way the states from 89, 90, but of course after 91 and 92, the independence, they were constructing and assigning national / so national is the Soviet naming and ethnic is like the international way, identities, okay? One chapter is dealing with the historical and ideological construction of national identities. This is a very Soviet narrative, okay? Lenin built the Kyrgyz identity because it didn't exist. It was a tribal group, etc. You know all of this, yeah? Everything was brought up and promoted, but it's a Soviet narrative, we know that, okay? There was an objective behind it. It was to promote this modern concept of nation in a region where it didn't exist, the modern concept of nation. And for Russia to manage such a region, there was a need to introduce this concept. Okay, that was, and the Soviets did the same, they didn't change at all. Okay, what I'm trying though, and this is why when the war in Ukraine started, I said, but actually these were questions that I was actually asking myself, but maybe not so audibly, it was not hearable. So actually, I was deconstructing this construction. The ethnic categorization of identities that the state was promoting and that the state still is promoting in Tajikistan, for instance, I try to deconstruct it. And I give you here an example. In the 50s and 60s, we had a late displacement of Tajiks from the mountains into the valley. The Kyrgyz had the same. They were transferred forcibly to work in the cotton field, okay, in the valley, because this is where the manpower was useful. In the mountain, it was useless. Those Tajiks were coming from a region where they had absolutely no contact with nothing else than their own culture. It was very remote mountains in the middle of Tajikistan. And for the Tajik Soviet regime authorities, but also for Tajikistan today, they do represent a kind of guarantee of clean identity. Okay, for those who know, Tajikistan is Mastro, this mountain Mastro. It's a very remote valley where only Tajiks are living, according to them, Tajiks. Yeah, when these Tajiks were moving down forcibly, they were forcibly put into buses and trucks to move, thousands of them moved into the valley. What they met in the valley, in the Ferghana Valley, were Uzbeks, Turkic-speaking people, because they were living there and there was no Tajik in the area where they were put. And everybody was frightened that actually these Tajiks will just come into the Uzbeks and the shock of civilization, and you know, the clash of civilization, Huntington. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. Why? Because the Uzbeks were actually welcoming these poor people. They were victims of the system. What would blame the Uzbek when they see these poor people coming from a mountain, dying because it's too hot, because they don't adapt to the situation? And what happened actually is the Tajiks between themselves, they started to have clashes and even to kill each other. People were killing each other. Why? Because in the mountains, the remote mountains, they were living in villages that were really remote and they were not really in contact. They were actually in competition for the use of resources in the mountains. When they were brought all together into a kolkhoz or a sovkhoz, they were all meeting together in a small area. And the conflict and the clashes that they had in the mountain were actually brought into the valley. And the identity that was predominant at this time was not to be a Tajik or an Uzbek, but to be part of a lineage of Tajiks, an avlod. That is the division of Tajiks among themselves. And the Soviet authorities had to remove some of the Tajiks and to send them 100 kilometers away in another kolkhoz just to avoid the Tajiks to be again fighting against each other. While with the Uzbek, there was absolutely no problem. So you see how actually where there is ethnicity, it's not working. Ethnicity doesn't work here to understand the social relations of these people. This was done in the 50s. I developed also an argument about the 90s in Tajikistan during the civil war and the movement of population. You had about almost 20,000 Kyrgyz from Tajikistan who moved actually to Kyrgyzstan in Balkan region, and they were not welcomed very well. They were considered as Tajik because they were wearing the tupi and not the kalpak, because they were actually like behaving like Tajiks. They were cooking plov and they were really like Tajikified, if you want to say. They were not accepted. The Kyrgyz didn't accept them, and they had a hard time, discrimination, and some of them went back to Tajikistan after all, in Jeglital area that was really poor and remote. So many examples are showing that actually ethnicity doesn't work always, and this is a way to deconstruct this assignment of identity. The last chapter of this part one is the counting, and this is very interesting also. How you count the population when you turn independent, and do you consider that the minority can be a threat for you? I will just show you some of the figures. Uzbekistan didn't do any census, it's just estimates. We don't have a census since 1989. But anyway, in Uzbekistan, the huge majority of Uzbekistan is defined as Uzbeks by the state, and the people themselves define themselves as Uzbeks. You do have some minorities, like Tajiks, some Kazakh, for instance, also a little bit of Kyrgyz. But Uzbekistan, the minority issue is more territorial, because it's, of course, at the border with Tajikistan. And this is why we'll see that Uzbekistan has cut all connection with Uzbeks from abroad. They didn't want at all any connection to interfere with them. In Kyrgyzstan, the census were perfect. Okay, you have an increase of the Kyrgyz. Why? Because the Russians are decreasing. We know that the Russians were the big group in Kyrgyzstan, huh? Almost a quarter of the population in '89, and now decreasing to very low level. Huh? But look at the Uzbeks, which is the second group. They are increasing, and nobody is hiding them. Okay, we know that there was tensions, clashes, but the census is done, and the Uzbeks are still important, and they are the second group by far now in Kyrgyzstan. And let's check now the Tajik. Sorry. Suddenly, between '89 and 2000, we have a big shrinking, 25%, 60% of Uzbeks. Where are they? They were killed in the war? No. They were leaving to Russia? Not more than the Tajiks. They were changing their identity just like this from one day to the other? Not really, because the census takers that I was interviewing are saying, no, I mean, in this village, I was counting and there was only Uzbeks, and I just wrote Uzbek because they told me they were Uzbek. Eventually, there was a manipulation, and the state in Tajikistan has manipulated this data. Okay, each time a UN organization or an international organization is using official data, I'm just telling, I mean, I'm writing an email saying, don't use the official data, they are wrong. I mean, you should still at least use the data from '89 because the population hasn't changed. Maybe the Russians have left, of course, because of the war. But the Uzbeks, they have no way to leave. They cannot go to Uzbekistan. They were refused in Uzbekistan during the war. They had to move back to Tajikistan. You are welcome just 2 years and then go back to Tajikistan. We don't want you. Although you are Uzbeks, yeah? Ethnically. So it means that in Tajikistan, there was a clear understanding that being an Uzbek, as the state was thinking, could be a danger for the country. Okay, so this is clearly a vision of an ethnic belonging that can be a threat for the country. Well, actually, it is not. It's just a perception, of course, because there was never an attempt of anything in Tajikistan section. And the Uzbeks were trapped in the middle of the war, and it was not an ethnic war, the civil war in Tajikistan. It was definitely a civil war between Tajikistan and themselves. Okay. Very quickly, because I don't want to take you too much time. I know that it's a lot of information, but just to share, the part two is the second stakeholders, the so-called ethnic civil society. And I'm here dealing with ethnic mobilization, how actually groups were actively claiming rights and demanding for more recognition, etc. This is what I call the minority representation in the public space, towards the administration, towards the public authorities, okay? I have also 3 chapters. One of them is dealing with the institutionalization of ethnic minorities. So how was built this ethnic civil society? Because there was no civil society in the USSR. And it's only in 1988 that the first legislation was adopted under the perestroika to allow the registration of non-profit organization and then for political parties. And there was this pluralism that developed even in political life. Okay. What is interesting in comparing Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan is the different model. In Uzbekistan, they have maintained till today the very Soviet-style friendship of people, Druzhba Narodov. Okay, 1st of September, National Day of Uzbekistan. Who is gathering? The Ukrainian Cultural Center, the Korean Cultural Center, the Tajik Cultural Center. They are all dancing beautifully on the square of independence, and we celebrate the diversity of Uzbekistan. Very folkloristic. Okay, nothing about political identity, just folklore. Civic council in Tajikistan during the civil war, it was hard time. And to gather the population at this time, there was the creation of a civic council. A council that was civic but composed of different groups, including representatives of ethnic groups, but also NGOs, etc. So it was an attempt at a time when in Tajikistan it was possible to do it. Today it's totally impossible. But to have a kind of consultative body giving some understanding, some advice, some demand also to the government, to the parliament. And this was named the Civic Council. It was working in the 90s, just after the Civil War. Now it's over, of course. And in Kyrgyzstan, you all know the Assembly of the People of Kyrgyzstan. Okay, this institution that hopefully you know, it is an institution, it's on the still on the square, where you have representatives of every single ethnic groups. Basically, it is a little bit the friendship of people, but not just gathering on the 1st of September. They do have a representation, and it is a consultative body that Askar Akayev created actually before Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was copying the model of Kyrgyzstan. It was Askar Akayev actually who invented this, just to give a voice to the diversity, also because politically it was receiving support for them. Okay, by recognizing this diversity, they were backing him and pushing for the vote among the different groups and communities. So it was also a political game, but still, Kyrgyzstan is quite proud of having such a structure to gather people together. Okay, so an example of comparison between the three countries. One very quick point is the politics towards co-ethnics abroad. Who are the co-ethnic abroad is how Uzbekistan is behaving with Uzbeks abroad, how Kyrgyzstan is behaving with Kyrgyz abroad. You have Kyrgyz in China, you have Kyrgyz in Afghanistan, you have Kyrgyz in Tajikistan. What is the politics? And actually, it was interesting because according to the moments of the development of the independent countries, but also of the countries, you can have mistrust total. Uzbekistan didn't trust at all the Uzbeks from Tajikistan, and even less the Uzbeks from Kyrgyzstan, because there was freedom of speech in Kyrgyzstan, and they didn't want the freedom of speech of Kyrgyzstan, of Osh, Dalabat, to come into Uzbekistan. So the border was closed. They put a visa regime. If you were an Uzbek from Kyrgyzstan, you had to go to Bishkek to get a visa to visit your family across the border. So it was impossible. Actually, there was a very distancing of Uzbekistan from all the Uzbeks, and they are the biggest group in Central Asia, the Uzbeks. 25% in Tajikistan, about 17% now in Kyrgyzstan, 4% in Kazakhstan, in Turkmenistan, etc. So this is a big issue. Dual citizenship was developed by Kyrgyzstan, by the way. Kyrgyzstan was banning dual citizenship in the beginning, and then step by step removed this banning, this prohibition, and now there is a possibility to have dual citizenship in Kyrgyzstan. That's interesting because it was open for the Kyrgyz from abroad to get to have quickly the Kyrgyz citizenship without relinquishing their own Russian, Tajik, whatever citizenship. And the last example is repatriation. You may also know that Kyrgyzstan has developed, and it is the only country among mine, but Kazakhstan did also, made a repatriation program that was directly targeting the Kyrgyz from abroad by providing them a quick citizenship, support, social aid, etc. And they were named Kairilman, it's the official name that was given to this program. It's the equivalent of the Oralman at this time in Kazakhstan. It worked quite well in Kazakhstan, like 1 million Kazakhs came from China mostly and Mongolia because of the money. They were given a lot of things. In Kyrgyzstan, it didn't work so well because Kyrgyzstan was at this time not so attractive as Kazakhstan, but still, dozens of thousands of them came, above all from Tajikistan during the civil war and Afghanistan. Shall I go quickly, maybe? 5 minutes? Yeah, I can open again. Yeah, maybe there is a... Yeah. Okay. The second point, I will be quick on this, is the representation in the public space, also here, of the ethnic minorities in the media. I was interested always to see, if you went to a kiosk in the 90s, to see this. So this was Tajik, Russian, and Uzbek. The same newspaper in 3 languages sold in the kiosk. And in Kyrgyzstan, you had a lot of private Maison, maybe you know, some of you. Maison, this was a big conglomerate of media. There was a TV, there was a newspaper, etc., managed by a big Uzbek businessman from Osh. So Maison was everywhere in Osh. You could buy it, and it's all in Uzbek. Oyna is in Tajik in Uzbekistan. Yeah, Tong is in Uzbek in Tajikistan. So it was all this kind of ethnic media, basically. Some of them being public, and you can see that this is definitely the public one, the Pravda, and then some private also. So there was a kind of business and resources behind it. Of course, it was a time when internet was not so active, so it was very visible. Today, you don't have so much. Still argumentative, facty probably everywhere, and that's so, yeah. So, but I was interested, and I developed some arguments on the feeling of being actually belonging to an ethnic identity by reading this, but some of them had actually content that were very transversal, like very for everybody. And actually, it was not just an article for Uzbeks in Osh. No, it was actually dealing with legislation in Kyrgyzstan and just to translate this legislation for the population to have access to their rights. And it was very interesting. Just to promote a new law that was passed in Bishkek that concerns the Uzbeks in Osh, and they should have access to it in their own language. So it was actually a content that was quite national, but the language was the form through which it was passed. And to finish, this is the ethno-political mobilization. Of course, this is the moment where you can organize yourself, mobilize the groups, forces, and then claim and try to get something. Interestingly, the first very active and organized mobilization took place in Uzbekistan, in Samarkand. When I discovered it, because usually you don't even mention it, like what's happening in Uzbekistan after independence, well, in Samarkand from 89, so before independence, but till the end of 92, so still the first year of independence, you had a big group organized, a cultural center, that then was moving into a political organization that started to claim, to demand recognition of the language status for Tajik in Samarkand, only for Samarkand, but to have the bilingualism, Uzbek-Tajik, but also asking for the possibility to change the mention of the ethnicity in the passport, the so-called Piatipunkt, the nationalist, that they could change, because actually most of them were forced to change into Uzbek in the Soviet times. They didn't want them to mention that they were Tajik, again, because of this risk of having too many Tajiks, so-called Tajiks. And I remember an old lady who told me, Man Bukhari, I am from Bukhara. I'm not Tajik, I'm not Uzbek, Man Bukhari, and that's all. But when the guy came and asked for my identity, I said Bukhari, and he mentioned Uzbek, but I'm not Uzbek. Okay, so it was interesting that they asked it, and actually the Tajiks in Samarkand started how do you say in strike, hunger strike? No. Hunger strike, and they obtained it. They obtained the possibility to change without paying. Because otherwise you have to pay for a new document, yeah, without paying, but the language issue was not solved. We don't have the recognition of Tajiks. So it's interesting because it existed, and many of them actually had to leave the country later when it turned really hard. And the second example that you probably know more, because it's about Kyrgyzstan, is the Uzbeks in Osh and Jalalabad, because actually you have different groups there. But I did in my research a sociology of these ethnic entrepreneurs. Why I say entrepreneurs? Because we use entrepreneurs to say that they were actually producing identity, but they were actually also businessmen, so real entrepreneurs in terms of money. Because actually ethnicity is a resource. Ethnicity and minority can be a resource for some of them. Maison, the newspaper, the TV was a big business. It was Davron Sabirov, I think, who was leading it. He was a big businessman, a millionaire, an oligarch, as we can say, a small oligarch, but still an oligarch. Yeah? Well, in Jalalabad, there was Batyrov, that you probably heard, yeah, with the big educational complex that he built. And that was a business, actually. In Uzbek, in Russian, a little bit in Kyrgyz as well, because they had to promote also this kind of diversity, but actually it was a business. And when they had an issue with the central government, they could easily use this business and mobilize people, saying, okay, they want to cut the budget, they want to cut our rights, they want to cut the use of language, they want to put an official language testing to enter the university, etc. And this is how they mobilize people. Just also, and we have to recognize it, to protect their business. So it was a manipulation also of identity. People were actually asking for their rights, but just because they were asked to move in the street and to start doing this protest. Okay, it's not this that ended into the conflict of 2010, and I have a full chapter in this part dealing with it because actually it's different. But what I wanted to say is that actually these entrepreneurs, ethnic entrepreneurs, are really individuals and they have different profiles. I met some of them actually, and it was interesting. Some are now in Belarus, but Batirov is here, for instance. And this was the Kurultai, the big meeting of all the Uzbek association of the South. So you had Osh, Jalalabad, you had 3 different organizations in Osh that were competing each other, etc. So if you're interested just in this chapter, at least it will just open your eyes on what was, because all of them are in exile today. What was the logic and the dynamic in terms of ethnic mobilization of this time. Okay. And the last part, I just finished quickly, is about the individual identity strategies, and I did a focus here on education. You can take any niche, it can be education, it can be economic, like I said, an economic sector. I decided to focus on education. Why? Because actually, the multilingual education is, something that exists from the Soviet period everywhere, even in Russia. Now in Russia, it's pretty much Russian. Non-Russian schools are really going down. But in Central Asia, you do have still multilingual education. That means that you have different groups of language according to what you want to give to your pupils. It's not in parallel, it's you identify and you send your pupils to the Kyrgyz school, to the Tajik school, to the Uzbek school, to the Russian school, etc. And there is this legacy, and it's one of my chapters. And I studied the education policies of each of the 3 states after independence, how actually they had to manage such an expensive system of education. In France, we have only 1 language, and some regional languages that are actually mostly done on private funds. It costs a lot, education. In Uzbekistan, it's 7 languages education. 7 languages, okay? Russian, Kazakh, Tajik, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Karakalpak, Turkmen, okay? They do have hundreds of schools that are not non-Uzbek schools, and they are still maintaining them, okay? So you need a lot of money to translate the new school textbooks, to train the teachers in their language, to organize the tests, etc. for the university. It's a lot. In Kyrgyzstan, it was 4 languages. In Tajikistan, it was 5. So you have different approaches to this. I will not go into details, but one interesting example is, and to show that actually before Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan signed their border agreement like 2 months ago, there was already good cooperation between the 2 countries before. In 2001, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan signed an intergovernmental agreement on education to deal with the minority schools of each country. So basically, you had about 40 Kyrgyz schools in Tajikistan and 40 Tajik schools in Kyrgyzstan. It's a very small number in comparison to the Uzbek schools, which are like hundreds. So 40-40. The 2 states were too poor in the 90s, early 2000s to take care of them, to produce textbooks, to train teachers, etc. They were still using, I remember visiting schools in early 2000s, they were using textbooks from the Soviet times. They were like with scotch everywhere. I mean, it was terrible conditions. And the content was Soviet. I mean, they were still learning about Lenin, etc. So there was a real need to do it. And what they say is like, since we are developing actually national programs, let's have Tajikistan dealing with the Tajik schools of Kyrgyzstan. And let's have Kyrgyzstan dealing with the Kyrgyz school of Tajikistan. We don't care. It's a small number. There is no risk of separatism or independence. And at least it's a burden we don't have to manage. And this intergovernmental agreement was doing everything perfectly. The money was shared, transferred, etc. The money that was paid, they were providing textbooks from Kyrgyzstan, but Tajikistan was purchasing them to be sent to the schools and vice versa. There were stipendia for students to continue their education, because when you end up with Kyrgyz education in Tajikistan, where you go? There is no Kyrgyz university. So then they were going to Bishkek and they had some scholarship given by the government, and vice versa for the Tajiks, etc. So it was interesting to see that it existed, and they tried to do. Eventually, it ended because, of course, basically what you are producing is citizens of the other country. If you are using the full package of education, I remember visiting a school where the textbook of the Tajiks in Kyrgyzstan was putting Emomali Rahman as their president. They are living in Kyrgyzstan, but they thought that Emomali Rahman was their president, because they didn't know who was in Bishkek. So it's interesting that eventually it didn't work, but for some years, it was a good way to solve this kind of issue. And to finish my last chapter of the book is that I just worked on one aspect is the choice of the language of education by the parents. When you're a parent, the rule is that the school in the beginning of the year or the end of the previous year is asking, do you have a new kid to put in the school? Which language would you like? You give your choice. If they gather enough number, they have the obligation to open a group for the language that is required. The languages were offered. You don't ask for Ukrainian language, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, yeah? But Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Russian, Tajik were the group offered. And I tried to see what was the logic behind it. Who was asking for which language? And I ended up with this. You had language conservatism. That means actually maintaining the minority language to whatever cost it is. I am an Uzbek in a village of South Kyrgyzstan. I want to maintain the Uzbek and I will send my kids to an Uzbek schools. You did have this. And sometimes in very remote areas, just as a survival strategy, we have to protect ourselves because we are just very few and we risk to lose our identity. So this exists. It's lower and lower, of course. This was probably also a reaction from the Soviet building of identity. The second one, which is also interesting, is the civic integration, quite increasing a lot, above all among minorities. Uzbek minority in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, now is going a lot into Kyrgyz and Russian education, not anymore in Uzbek. They have a choice, they can go on, Kyrgyzstan is not banning it, they don't want. Because they know that eventually they will not go to university, so they prefer to send their children to Russian and Kyrgyz schools. So it's education in the official language. A kind of civic integration because you take the language of the state you are living in, although you are a minority. So these are usually the two options, either the ethnic mother tongue or the civic official language of the state. But there was a third one that was quite interesting. It's an alternative choice that was driven by economic concerns. Russian language. Not just because Russian is spoken in Kyrgyzstan, but just because my sons will actually migrate to Russia and get work. And if you speak good Russian, you will get better position, you will not be cheated by the authorities and the administration in Russia, etc. Uzbek language in the Ferghana Valley is attracting a lot. All the villages at the border of Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan, where you had Kyrgyz pupils or Tajik pupils, actually the parents said, we go to Kosansai, we go to this area, Kobasai, Ferghana. I mean, this is our environment. It's much more useful to speak Uzbek than actually Kyrgyz in Kyrgyzstan. So the Tajiks in Uzbekistan, for instance, were going to an Uzbek school in Kyrgyzstan. Tajiks in Kyrgyzstan, they're learning Uzbek. Why? Just because Uzbek is actually a strategic language for them in a local community cross-border. Okay, so I'm going very quickly, but this is something I'm trying to explain also in the book and trying to make some kind of structure of understanding of these strategies. I think I have a conclusion, but I can finish here because otherwise it's already like 6:30. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.